I got asked yesterday about a title. And it was funny because the solidarity economy in relationship to the context we live is a hugely challenging proposition in the context of neoliberal capitalism. But as Pat knows, and a mentor of mine, Pat Conady over here, we've worked together in various ways, we took up a Welsh aphorism, I guess, poet, who said, our job is to make hope more concrete and despair less convincing. And this particular image, which is of the lowest plateau, which is where the Han civilization was born, that is Chinese civilization, has looked like it did in 1995 for millennia, really. And given what is a giant permaculture project, if you will, in 14 years you can see the difference. The difference that made to livelihoods, the difference it made to water retention, the difference it made to carbon sequestration, et cetera, et cetera. That's ecological restoration with multiple benefits, right? That on a global scale represents what we have to do a lot more of and represents solidarity with each other and with the planet at the most fundamental level given the challenges we face. Anyway, that's why I just wanted to let you know why I chose that. So I was asked to do a number of things tonight, and you can see them there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I'm just going to run right into it. So I just want to go a little bit, at least in personal terms, where I see some of the thinking and evolution of the bigger picture that really one can locate the solidarity economy within. And Karl Polanyi, who wrote The Great Transformation, it's an amazingly important book, and he was considered really probably the best economic historian of the 20th century, maybe one of the best economic historians ever. And he certainly picked up on the points you were making in the context of reciprocity being the central principle that governed economic life for most of human history. And that really social relations actually were the basis upon which economic exchange was framed. There was many things that were much more important than economic exchange in past societies. But the evolution of the big M market, what he calls going from the small M market, you can think of the guilds or fair price or, and govern trade relations, that you're moving to the big M market where profit was the central economic principle. Anyway, so we know that part of our challenge in the context of doing this work is that economic relations govern social life in a big way and degrade and are ongoing degrading of nature's life support systems. So the other big idea that he had was this idea of the double movement. It was kind of a dialectic between the rise of the big M market, and I think you were talking about some of the counter movements. So if you think of the land and Thomas Paine and the counter movement in terms of enclosure of the land and so on and so on and so forth. So I want to say a little bit by way of background around the roots. So, you know, I mean, you guys invented the enclosure of the commons as far as I know. You know, we don't know anything about that in Canada. And the struggle to reclaim the commons. That's one of those big pieces that have characterized the evolution over the last 400 or 500 years of where we sit in this big struggle, and it's still in process. So if you think of what's going on in the Dakotas, quite apart from the public bank, and you have this huge, unprecedented convergence of Aboriginal people from not only across the United States, from other parts of the world as well, standing up to the question of land and water. And then you've got you've got alternatives being built, right? The land trust movement grew out of marginalization and exclusion and being able to have decent accommodation at a price that can be perpetually affordable. And then you have the enclosure of the economy for private benefit and the struggle to democratize and localize ownership for common benefit. That's nothing new to anybody here. I think we all recognize that that's part and parcel of the tension and the struggle that we're embedded in. But there's this whole question that it's also built in, and it's built into the pedagogy of even how we do our work. I mean, opposition is important, and it is going to be important for a long time to come, and proposition is also important. So we got the current situation with TTIP and TPP, which is absolutely counter to anything that will enable the kind of values we represent and the kind of aspirations we have to thrive. And then we have, in that context, which is not the only example, obviously, we have the emergence of the solidarity economy as a kind of way of trying to align a variety of different things, as was said earlier by Tony. And then we have the third big enclosure, which is of money and capital, and the struggle to transform both from masters to servants. And this is, people don't understand this basic fact. And this is based on German research that was done, oh gosh, a couple of decades by now ago, but it holds true. So if you think of compound interest, you can think about that in terms of your mortgage, but if we understand that 35% of the costs of goods and services are the results of embedded compound interest up and down the supply chains, that's pretty significant. And if you think that 600 million, this is just in Germany, 600 million euro a day going from the bottom 80%, right, to the top 10%, that's a big factor in inequality, I would say, over time. The other from is predatory banks. Look at the difference in profits over a short period of time. That represents neoliberalism gone outside of the regulatory regimes we had between the Depression and 1975. That's the result. Nice graphic, eh? Poor mother. Look at her falling away from those banks. And then, what we're trying to move towards, as has already been said, convivial money and capital invested for citizen, community benefit, ecological benefit. I mean, that's part of what we're struggling to figure out how to do and how to diffuse and how to scale up impacts. So that's kind of a bit of big picture background. Now, where did this question of the solidarity economy start to take shape? In terms of people's concrete struggles, and where this language and the kind of sensitivity to it has absolutely no meaning. But of course, it's an important issue. I'm not saying it's not, and it always needs to be thought of in context. So I don't know, I mean, if people remember back in 1968, all of the bishops from the Roman Catholic Church gathered in Puebla, and they made a statement that was really significant statement in the context of the central core of the message from the Christian faith in the Bible was liberation. And it wasn't just spiritual liberation. It was about recovery of sight to the blind, setting at liberty those who are oppressed, release of the captives, and that had a material and political context within which it was raised. Well, if you look over to the right there on that slide, and you see that bare land, the people that migrated out of areas where they could no longer live into Lima, into this private land, and occupied it, and then had the military come to try and remove them from it, but continued to occupy it, and eventually built Villa del Salvador, which is now actually part of Lima. But they had to create an economy. They had no property rights. The state was, both at the municipal and the national level, was very antagonistic. And they put together the pieces because they had no one to rely on other than each other, and how reciprocity and mutuality and aid could in fact allow them to build a life. So they were dealing with opposition. There was nobody they could make propositions to, but they could use their own resources to build. The people who were involved in that from a faith perspective became the people who in 1997 invited people who were struggling in various ways with these issues to a seminar in Lima for 60 people. And there was a number of people in Canada, from Quebec, a few people from Europe, and a couple of people from Africa. Well, they invited 60, and 240 showed up from 20 countries, right? Anyway, there's been a rhythm. So every 4 years after that, there's been a gathering. Jason over here, who you're going to hear later, is kind of one of the key networkers and on the board of the European. It's an Intercontinental Network for promotion of the social solidarity economy. I was on the first board. It's one of the worst experiences of my entire life. Anyway, and I was the program chair. I went to my first meeting in 2002, and the program chair for Dakar, which was the third meeting. And honest to God, I'll tell you, 1,600 people came from 67 countries, and I didn't know. I mean, it's 4 languages. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm just glad I got off the board and people like Jason and others kind of occupied it, then from all the continents, because we were only 4 for that first board. Anyway, you don't want to know more about that. I want to forget it. So Europe, you know, I mean, Jason will tell you more about what's evolving in Europe. But, you know, there's a number of things that have actually had impacts as a result, not just of RIPESS, but RIPESS has played an important role. I mean, it's spoken at the United Nations, you know, the UN Research on Institute of Social Development convened 14 agencies of the UN, so there's a lot of language and interaction and research. There's a lot of people that are talking about this. The ILO has an academy that invites people every year to come from all over the world on the solidarity economy, the International Labour Organization. So I just want to give you a feel that this is evolving, and it's the language is being appropriated. Now, it's not necessarily always being interpreted the same way, but you get my point. Okay, so the next thing I was asked to do was try and define solidarity economy. Well, you'll know this. You'll be glad to know that this very complicated graph was not written by me, but by a person, a Brit, actually, John Pierce. Wonderful guy, died a few years ago. But he was really trying, and he interacted with a lot of people in Europe around trying to characterize and depict the social economy. And so the first system is what we talked about, a private property owner. The second system, at least in theory, is public service and planned provision, although we know that the kind of influence of the first system and the second system is creating a few problems here and there. And then you have the third system, which is kind of oriented to self-help, reciprocity, social purpose. And within that, you know, you can see the trade unions in there. I'm not going to go into all the detail, obviously, voluntary charities, finance. But there's a group of those, you see the social economy there, that are trading in the market for social purpose. That is more or less been the quote-unquote third sector definition of the social economy. And John would say, if you were here and still alive, that there's kind of the conventional view that you operate the social economy in order to operate in the market and appropriate social value for people who are being excluded. But there's a more radical orientation in which you think that the social economy is going to contaminate the other systems, and that will lead to social change. Well, I kind of decided that this really wasn't very relevant to the context. I didn't think the social economy was going to contaminate anybody very far, and so I reconfigured this. The first time I presented this, which I'm not an academic, I mean, I hardly did 3 years of university, but when I presented this at an academic conference, everybody in the room who were from the social economy were ready to lynch me. Because I said, in the context that we live, forget it in terms of the social economy being a contaminator for good for the world and all's going to be nice and wonderful. It's not. We live in crisis. There's people within each of those systems who are struggling and are recognizing the mess we're in, and that we want to have a strategic orientation to align ourselves around common values. We may have differences, but a contextual analysis says we got to bring ourselves into coalitions that can begin to leverage the kind of systems change as well as the concrete alternatives we need to build. So that's what I call the solidarity economy, and actually people are actually using this graphic elsewhere. I noticed Jason had it in one of his papers, so I can say I've had some influence somewhere. Why do we need to do this? That's why we need to think about solidarity in terms of solidarity and what it means. You know, we want to get to one planet again. When I was born, I'm obviously older than you, although I didn't know it until you told me. No, I'm just kidding. When I was born, which was a little bit before 1960, you know, we were still living in with one Earth. And, you know, we're at 1.6 now. The trajectory we're on to 3, and we got to get back to 1. I mean, that ain't going to happen by virtue of the market doing everything or debt-based financing. It's not going to happen. So we got a challenge. So I wrote this piece. I was speaking in Buffalo. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'd written these words, and somebody introduced me by reading them, and then Jules, what's his name? Peck. Wrote me after and says, could you send me that quote? And I said, okay. And I looked in the book that Pat and I wrote. I went through that book about 6 times, couldn't find it anywhere. Anyway, I had to write Gus Speth and say, where did you get that quote that I wrote? Anyway, this is kind of the basic summary, in my view. It's a framework of concept, values, practices, model, resilience over growth, cooperation over competition, sufficiency over efficiency, well-being over the right to possess, fairness and equity over the freedom of markets, trade, and capital, decentralized and democratic ownership over concentrated private ownership, the commons over the inalienable rights of private property, our dependence on nature over the right to denominate it. So it's kind of a frame. It's not the practice, but it's a way of keeping in mind what it is that we're talking about. Okay, so I'm saying that, you know, there's some things that are more important than others, and that we need to orient ourselves to basic needs and build our capacity in a decentralized way, but in a federated way to, in fact, do this much better than we're doing it now. So food, energy, shelter, you could add social care. I mean, I've got other slides. I couldn't find the one with social care on it. But within all of these, we have to reclaim finance. We have to work at reclaiming the commons, which has been privatized almost to the nth degree. And we got to democratize and localize ownership. So it's how we set the warp and the weft to build that weave and take Rochdale, if you will, to use the weaver's thing, into a whole other dimension, a whole other scope, a whole other scale. And so, you know, we've done a lot of thinking about these things, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the place shaping piece. I did a much more extensive, detailed this afternoon on this. But I do want to say that the way we work at place and the way we link together where the gaps are in our local settings or in our regional settings, often it's more than one community, around key economic functions, and how we link together the social functions, you will see in what I say just briefly about this example, how place-based community economic development has got to have solidarity at the mix, at the heart of it, and that social enterprise and co-ops are means by which that can be done at the enterprise level. So this particular community, it was downhill for 3 decades, been going downhill. And you can see the leaky bucket analogy there. But what they did over a period of 25 years is build an organization that was multi-stakeholder. It had community organizations, who are the ones that started it in this really poor neighborhood, now 5 neighborhoods. Small business representation, big business representation, trade union representation, financial institution representation. All of these had to be rooted in the community, mind you, okay? Public health and the whole question of health represented. And quite capable of bringing in people on an advisory basis from the municipality if it was necessary. So they built this multi-stakeholder capacity, and they did a whole variety of things focused on planning, research, and advocacy, building local ownership in terms of existing businesses and their retention, and building the competence of people to, in fact, take part in the emerging emerging projects and businesses and jobs that were emerging out of this process. Now, without going into the detail, all I'm going to tell you is 9 years later, an area that had manufacturing decline for 30 years was stopped. Today, what they're doing is they're managing growth, and they are actively defending still those neighborhoods' interests over the ongoing process, and they have had a major impact on reduction of poverty. So, it's a pretty interesting model. I could tell you lots of stories about that. They had 1,500 individual members of the community. We're only talking about 5 neighborhoods that have 80,000 people. They had 300 organizational members and 1,500 individual members. And people had huge assemblies every year. So it was a participatory process. But because they were organized that way, they had all kinds of impacts. You think about social enterprise, they had social enterprise in the social support area, social enterprise in the culture area, social enterprise in literacy. They created probably 50 plus enterprises over a period of 15 years or so. And that was probably around 400 or 500 jobs associated just with that. Never mind the other jobs that were created as a result of other situations. All right. So, you can see the key economic functions, the key social functions. You just saw that. The community isn't important, not to forget it, because some people in the social solidarity economy just can't even talk about geography. They're just thinking about enterprise, enterprise, enterprise. Enterprise is really important, but enterprise is not necessarily the end game. So there's more than one domain for acting in the solidarity economy. Territory and enterprise are both important. I just want to make a note here. I just spent 3 weeks in Greece, and I was doing some teaching there, but I visited a place called Kaditsa. I want to pick up, Tony, on one of your comments. This was a small, rural, one big town, but basically a rural prefecture, like a county here. They had a cooperative development bank, and they had a very closely linked development agency. And they were amazing. They have 100 million in this, what you were talking about, a district cooperative development bank. And the way they think is, they think small business development with individuals, with families, co-ops. They're doing huge stuff in the co-op development area, and energy and food and da-da-da-da-da. It's very interesting. It's the only place in Greece it's happening that I was able to see, and I talked to a lot of people from different parts of Greece. So this idea of attachment to territory and how it directs also how we think about it, because one of the things that I found is people had a very strong ideological orientations that ended up separating them from working with certain kinds of people just based on what they thought, or what they thought their politics were given. Anyway, I just wanted to say it's very interesting, and picking up on your comment, Tony, that can be done in Greece in the midst of their situation, and that cooperative bank it's able to hold its own. Okay, so sectors are also parting. And you can see I've changed the language here a little bit. Community resilience, cooperative economic democracy, you can read in all of that from my point of view, solidarity economy. I just want to talk a little bit and introduce some examples. And I'll have to be very quickly, obviously. I've gone on too long at the front end. So a couple of food examples. How many have heard of the Saikatsu cooperative in Japan? Yeah, okay, a few of you, maybe 5 or 6. Here's the basic idea, and I just want to give you an idea of how something can start on a small scale. That is with a group of women talking to a farmer saying, we're worried about the quality and so on of the food we're getting. We're worried about farmers leaving the land. We're worried about a whole bunch of things, and we want to negotiate organic produce from you. We'll pay you a fair price. He says to them, okay, you know, you just guarantee that you're going to deal with the whole distribution side if you want all of the stuff I'm producing, which that was the beginning of the essentially purchasing collectives, which were called Hans, which usually around 10 to 15 people. You can see it there on your left. And they had door delivery, and they also had voluntary run food depots. Very modest beginning. You wonder where CSAs come from? That's where CSAs came from. That's its origin in Japan. So it migrated into various parts of the world from, as far as I've been told and understand at this point. So if there's any scholars, tell me after, not right now. But these Hans, over time, which were rooted locally but focused on a particular sector, they grew. And they had to find ways of aggregating their coordination, which they created consumer cooperatives at the prefecture level or county level. There's now, 32 of these consumer cooperatives, and there's probably around 400,000 members. And they have also federated on the national level into the Saikatsu Union Club. Now, just on the food side, and this is about 5 years old, their sales were 1.1 billion. And the equity they had in this was 450 million. 450 million in equity. How did they get that equity? Well, they were able to, keep the ship going with their revenues, but what they had, it was a voluntary contribution, a check-off of $11 a month, up to a maximum of $3,500. Their members are who have created that equity. And that's created the financial stability and the basis upon which they've co-produced and co-invested in a transformation not just of the production and consumer, but the entire value chain. So they set ecological and greenhouse gas standards and the way they deal with packaging and recycling, everything. There's 600 workers collectives that are along that chain, and there's 17,000 worker owners. So imagine that little group of women, based on some clear standards, been federated over time, they achieve scale. And they've also got into elder care in a big way. It's about 100 million in revenue the last time I saw, 1.4 million volunteer hours. They got cooperative ownership of renewables, not as big, but they in fact lobbied municipalities to co-venture with them to do joint ventures for community energy. Interesting, if you ask me. Okay, housing. Let's get an example. I know that Pat wants this one out there, and I'm going to make sure it is. So you all know about Henry George and what he had to say about the unearned increment, one of the leverage points for community land trusts, and essentially locking in social purpose into the land tenure ownership structure. So I don't know how, but I was asked to be on the Mayor's Task Force on Affordable Housing, thank you, in Vancouver, which is an oxymoron of the absolutely hugest dimension because we're the second most expensive market in the entire world. So it was entertaining, and I fought with the developers, as you can imagine, and I won some space for pilots on community land trusts and alternative financing. 2 years later, the political space was created for the council, Progressive Council, and as a result of the report. We now have the Co-op Housing Federation in British Columbia created a community housing land trust foundation many years ago. And so they had a legal vehicle already in place. So when the city said, look, we got pieces of land and we want letters of interest, Vancouver City Savings, a credit union, Co-op Housing Federation, through their land trust and a technical professional group that they'd all worked with in the housing sector before, they put together a proposal. They never even talked to anybody else at that. They just started negotiating. First time for the city, first time for this kind of scale of project. It's a $110 million project. It's got 358 homes, 2 nonprofit partners who are dealing with particular segments of the population, and a co-op, right, that was created for the purpose of being part of this development. 99-year lease. Anyway, I won't go into all the detail. The point is, it was a breakthrough, and it was a pretty big first project for all the parties involved. And the financing was very interesting. I'm sure you guys all thought you were going to love to come here tonight and talk about financing. But in any case, look at the city came up to the table big. So if you want to think of a social public partnership, this is a good example. I mean, they gave deep discount on the market value of that land. It's worth $24 million right there. New market funds. This is the foundations. I think you guys already have this, getting together essentially to provide capital on a much more flexible basis that's tailored to the project. It came in as equity. No money going to be paid back on that particular $10 million for another 8 years. Partner equity, the nonprofits brought in $4.8 million. Anyway, BC Housing, which is the government, they thought this is starting to look good, so they hopped in at the last minute. So you can see, it actually ended up being $111 million. Construction's all in process. I was at one of the, what do they call it, shovel ceremonies not long ago. Now here's the impact in a very high cost market. And the thing that I want to extract, that show you in a large real estate project, how solidarity can be built in, not only to the land tenure, but into the way in which rental pricing is created, because this is all rental. I couldn't convince them to try the home ownership. But you see on the right there, some people are paying above area median income up to 130% of area median income. But look down here for the people in the 3 bedrooms down there. The average is 69, but there's a lot of units that are coming in at 23% of market. That makes a big difference for people, whether they can live in that city at all, especially low-income people, right? So what you got is a cross-subsidy built into the business model, right? Now, the interesting thing, I mean, I know Pat and I were both pretty excited when we kind of made this breakthrough, but there's now 4 other projects. They got it. They conceived, the city conceived, and it took them 2 years to work through this. It wasn't easy. Interesting. Okay, energy. Another basic need. We know it's not controlled by communities quite yet. There's lots of progress that's been made, and your government, I understand, has been very progressive in pulling back every incentive possible. Funny thing, we got rid of that government that we had similar to that. Yeah, anyway. So I want to tell you about this place, not very far from you, southeast Sweden. This is a district municipality, 26 communities, largest 33,000, littlest 150. So it was one municipality, over 1,300 square kilometers. And they politically made a decision in 1999 to go fossil fuel free. Pretty cool. So what you can see there is you can see at the top essentially wood waste for combined heat and power feeding into a district heating system in the biggest city and 33,000 and another city of 8,000. Those are the 2 biggest communities. There's only 77,000 in the whole district. And the next one down on the left, you can see that they organized somehow the waste stream that fed into electricity generation. For biogas, they also did some pellet stuff for distribution where they couldn't do district heat. Oh, that was from the wood waste. And they've really made a bit of breakthrough in actually biogas in their entire municipal equipment and vehicles are all biogas, and in fact, I'm sure by this time their goal of having 800 buses for the bigger region running on biogas, and they were also going to the retail market and starting, because that's one of the toughest nuts to crack. So you can see this, I'm going back now 7 years, this data is. So they've made a lot of progress. Maybe not so much on this part, but on this part, so 1999, by 2008, they'd had generated enough wind for 6,500 homes, and they had wind that was equivalent to 50,000 homes underway. That's now completed. You can imagine, this is only a population of 77,000, so for they're exporting now into the broader part of southeastern Sweden. And they've got plans for offshore wind. Now, how did that work? The only way it worked is that the municipality owned it. They own the waste management company, and they own the utility, which means they have profits that they can reinvest in the ongoing process of energy transition and climate changer adaptation. You know, look at what's happening with governments now as the crisis deepens. Right? If we have not a means in our regions and closer to home where we have enough ownership, and municipalities are a hugely important ally in this, is we've got to have a basis for reinvestment. We got to think like this, because we can't expect, governments are absolutely important, but we as governments hit crisis, I mean, we've seen what's happened in the current model, and we're not out of the double movement by any means yet and on the ascendancy. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry, Pat. I can't stay with this one. Oh, me. Okay, I'll give it a stab. The point is, how are you going to deal? How are we going to deal with all of this based on debt-based financing? So I want to go up to the macro for a moment, okay? And maybe you'll let me just kind of conclude this. Okay, this is, you know, in the next 10 years, we need 12.1 trillion. That's the latest figures, just for the renewable stuff. On ecological restoration, which is hugely important internationally, there's the bond challenge in that. There's a whole variety of estimates, but it's like 150 billion a year if we really wanted to reclaim enough acreage to have a big impact on local environments, but also to have an impact on carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas sequestration. These are huge opportunities in terms of jobs and benefits and so on, if we had a way of investing in them that wasn't bound up in private debt being the basis of we always did our calculations. You know what I mean? I mean, it just, so we have, like in Vancouver, in 2013 I read a report. It was a really interesting report on how much it was going to cost to deal with bringing sea level rise protection up 1 meter. You all would have loved reading it. It was a really interesting engineering report. Well, their estimate in 2013 was that it was going to cost 11.5 billion. Well, where's that money going to come from? The municipal tax base? Right? From private banks? From investors trying to figure out the calculation of how they're going to get their money back in order to help sea level rise? I mean, honest to goodness. So I want to just tell you that we had 35 years where we did do debt-free financing. We fought the war. We built the Trans-Canada Highway. We built the St. Lawrence Seaway. We put in the cornerstones of our social security system, our health system, all on a no-debt basis. Never went to the markets to finance all of that. So essentially, this is how it worked. Very simple. You know, I really don't need to get into this because of the time thing, but essentially what we did is the Bank of Canada got nationalized in 1938. That means we owned it. That means all the money they made out of charging the federal interest for the bonds that were sold was all repatriated in dividends. So the effective cost was an administrative cost of 0.0375%. No compounding, that was just the cost. Well, that made a big difference. Our accumulated debt as a nation since the time you let us become independent until 1973 was 37 billion. Trudeau the father of the current Prime Minister, caved to the Bank of International Settlements, which is a private bankers group, to say, no more of this, please. Borrow from the banks, because you'll create inflation if you deal with these spendthrift ways, which they caved. 1975 to 1995, our accumulated debt was $500 billion. The Auditor General for the nation, note to parliamentarians that that's 91% of that is the result of compound interest, compounding on compound interest. We paid interest of $1 trillion in the last 40 years. For $1 trillion. And what do you get? Where do you think austerity policy comes from? Right? And what's the line? Milton Friedman had the line. It's all about the invisible hand. You go to your first reference, and it's all about, making sure that the private sector is in a position to continue to generate economic benefits in the way that's supposed to happen. We have a current infrastructure program of $20 billion. I did a back of the napkin, right? $20 billion. I looked at the cost of capital for our federal government. It's 2.7%. Toronto, it's like almost 5%, big city. So I said, okay, 2.7, let's take 0.5% off, and let's see what that 2.2% is going to cost us in the 20 years if we were to amortize the whole thing over 20 years. It's going to cost us $14 billion just for 2.2% compound interest. How can we think that we're going to deal with navigating transition if our public good and sovereign potential is compromised at that level? Yeah, so you can think about, just coming from Greece, I'm really aware of the death trap it represents. So this is the last slide, and it kind of apropos to, I think you were asking the question about, you can see there those graphics that I've kind of built from. But the thing is we have to think much more smartly about how we find our ways of connecting to other movements that already exist, whether in here, the positive money, you got a basic income guarantee, of course you got the trade unions, you got the National Community Land Trust, there's other stuff going on. I mean, you've got a lot of stuff going on, but we got to wire these things together. We got to understand that this is the only planet we have, and it's the basis upon which we're going to have some chance of surviving with any kind of dignity. Is going to be to the extent that we can increase our leverage, which means we got to federate tables and coalitions, and not just in our sector, although that's important, but across, and begin to build our political leverage for real systems change. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the extra time.